So welcome, ladies and gents, to this wonderful, beautiful day in world history. I'm excited to see everyone. I'm excited that you're tuning in to learn a bit during this time when there's beautiful weather outside and we're kind of getting ready to go to get warmed up and jump into summertime. But we're finishing strong in these last 2 weeks, and today we're going to talk about the Cold War. We're going to continue our discussion over the details of the Cold War. Now, if you remember yesterday, we talked about the very beginning, the start of the Cold War. Now we're going to talk about some of the nitty-gritty details and talk about how we get to the point where the United States and the Soviet Union are really at each other's throats, and they're going to continue to be for like 50 years during this time period that we call the Cold War. So when we start thinking of things like the creation of groups like the Taliban that come from the Mujahideen, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, all of those different conflicts are tied to the Cold War in some way. And so we're going to talk about that. We're going to break that down, and we need to understand that background. Now, the way we're going to do that today is we're going to cover just a few minor details as we talk out some different issues with the Cold War. We have a couple slides to look at, and then we have a quick quiz to finish today where you have 10 quick questions over the stuff that we've talked about the Cold War, just to make sure you're staying accountable and you can prove your knowledge to me so that we can keep up to date with all that stuff that's going on. So make sure we're following along and doing that. Before we jump in here today, one thing I want to make sure to reiterate to you guys is I want to take a look at where we left off, and I also want to look at our classroom page. So if you take a look at classroom, I am going to assign right now, okay, and it's going to be going out to you guys so that you have this, and this is what we're going to do, all right? I'm assigning you guys our quick little quiz that we have for today over the stuff that we are learning together right now in this class. So make sure to stay accountable, make sure to follow along, and if you really want to, you can have that quiz open as we go through and we talk about these things, so it's going to be nice and easy to answer, all right? But it should have gone out to everyone. You should be able to have access to that quiz now. Now, on Classroom, remember I post your daily agenda, all your stuff. Today, a few gentle announcements, all right? Number one, make sure you're getting all your stuff done because you're running out of time. Like I said, it's our last 2 weeks. You got to be staying on top of stuff. You got to be crushing it. You got to be turning it in so that you can get points. If you're just showing up to class, that's awesome. I love to see you. I love to hear from you. But you're not getting any points unless you're turning stuff in. So make sure to do that so that you can raise your grade and get ready to go. Now, another thing to remind you guys. Remember that even if you get 100% on eLearning, that means you turn all of your assignments in and you get 100% on those assignments that you turn into me. You're only going to raise your grade by 20%. So if you are failing beyond that point, right, if you've got like a 2% in my class, you're going to have a nice, real close heart-to-heart discussion with me over making up some of the work that you needed to turn in before we went on our COVID-19 hiatus, all right? And we need to work out how you're going to turn that in, because that's the only way that you can raise your grade. Now, something to remind you guys of is that that is always an available option during this time. Because we're going through all these crazy times with COVID, all right, there is always an opportunity. It's through Grand Island Public Schools, like our grading policy has been adopted for this time to mean that you can go back and you can be making up work, okay, that you might have missed or that you didn't turn in before we went on this break. Okay, so you have to make sure that you're getting that done, that you reach out to me, that we create a plan, and that way we can make yourself successful. Guys, it takes very little effort to get literally an A in my class this semester. Easy as pie, all right, especially with all the stuff that we've been giving you. Cutting you a lot of breaks. Make sure to stay on top of that and talk to me if you need any help. But I don't want to beat a dead horse. I want to make sure that we cruise through some of the stuff that we're going to do today. So make sure you're staying on top of that and getting your assignments done. Always check the classwork tab because that's going to show you all the things that you need to get done and you can turn it in. All right? Stay on top of that. Make sure you're good to go. So without further ado, we're going to continue our discussion on what's going on with the Cold War. We have a few different things to talk about really quick, nice and easy, and then you're going to take that quiz, turn it in, and you're going to get those points. So make sure you stay cogent. Make sure you're watching, you're listening, you're learning. All right, if you need to take notes, pull out those notes, whatever you've been using to stay accountable in this class, to write down all your stuff. And we're going to continue talking about this war between the Soviets and the United States. Even though it's not like an aggressive military action war, it's the Cold War. There's no open, overt military actions against one another. They instead fight these things called proxy wars. Things are complicated. They politically don't get along, and they're competing like nobody's business. And so that's what we're talking about. Now, remember, we left off right here where we talked about the Iron Curtain. Guys, the reason I wanted to bring this up again today is if you look at this picture, this beautiful little map we have right here, it is a wonderful depiction of how separated and divided Europe was during this time of the Cold War. Remember, they came up with a specific saying. This was called the Iron Curtain, the separation between communist Europe and areas of Europe that were under Russian or Soviet influence, and then areas of Europe that were under the influence of the United States, democracy, capitalism. All right, so you have this idea, it's communism versus capitalism, if you boil it down to the very basis idea of the Cold War. Now, there are tons of little complex things that makes it a little different than that, but that is the ultimate crux. Communism versus capitalism, and they're at war for 50 years, all right? And we see this kind of kick off. Now, where did we leave off? A few reminders of what we were talking about before. Guys, World War II had ended. It was over. The world was left with two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States. Remember, the Soviets, they were still powerful, but they had suffered tons and tons of loss. Their country had suffered. Their factories had suffered. Life was tough for them. And then you had the United States. Now, they had suffered a lot. 400,000 Americans died in World War II. But the U.S. still had their factories. They still had a pretty vibrant population, and they were still really, really pretty rich. And so they were successful. The Soviets were successful. We have these two world superpowers. Europe was destroyed. They were in shambles after World War II, and they were suffering. That's where we left off. Remember, we had all those bombing raids. We had the colossal civilian impact of World War II. World War II killed the most civilians of any war ever. It was insane. The communist Soviets were seizing as much as they could. Remember, they created that Iron Curtain, that blockade, where they took over all those countries that were in between the Soviet Union and Germany, and they made that their buffer zone. And they turned them all communist, and they made them follow the rule of the Soviets, basically. And that's when we had the development of the Iron Curtain. And the U.S. was capitalist and democratic, while the Soviets were communist. I just want to reiterate to you guys, it's these two warring philosophies, okay? So that's where we left off. Now, where do we go from there? Remember, we left off with the Iron Curtain, but now things start to get a little more serious as this conflict and this competition starts to ramp up a little bit between the United States and the Soviets. So after the Soviets set up this Iron Curtain, guys, the United States started to take a stand. And when I say they started to take a stand, I mean they started to make some moves in which they were going to do things that might really make the Soviet Union not only challenge them, but make them mad, all right? So one of the first things that the United States did after the establishment of the Iron Curtain and the Soviet bloc, which is that area, that buffer zone that we were talking about that had all that communist influence, the U.S. came up with this thing called the Truman Doctrine. Now, you've probably heard both of these things before because you learned about them when you took American history last year. But I just want to reinforce two of the things that the United States does right off the bat once the Iron Curtain was established. The U.S. comes up with, like I said, the Truman Doctrine, which was basically a policy of containment for communism. President Harry Truman of the United States said, okay, here's the deal. I 100% will support this idea that we need to contain communism, we should not let it spread, and we will give support to any country that rejects communist influence and ideas. So it was basically like bribing other countries to stay away from adopting communism. And the Truman Doctrine was something that the United States adhered to throughout the Cold War. The fact that they were going to stop the spread of communism and that they were going to do it really at all costs. Now, along with the Truman Doctrine, guys, the U.S. also adopts this thing called the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan was this assistance program that the United States came up with, in which they're like, hey, Western Europe is completely beat up. They're battered. They are ruined after World War II. The way that we're going to help them out is we will give them tons and tons of money to rebuild. We'll give them machinery, we'll give them money, we'll give them food, but they can't be communists if they want to get all this money. And so it's like another kind of bribery program almost that the United States starts to use to reject and fight against communist influence. And this is where we see really the roots of the Cold War start to spread out and start to become so ingrained in the way that world politics worked that it starts to grow into this 50-year conflict. All right? Now, the Marshall Plan was crazy, guys. $12.5 billion were supposed to get all of these big changes done and to support the rebuilding of these places in Western Europe. So the United States comes up with two very strong positions that they take up against the Soviets, and they act those out, all right? So they come up with these two plans. Now, as you could probably guess, this doesn't make the Soviets very happy. In fact, they see this as the United States using their riches, using their wealth to bribe other countries into not becoming communist. And in reality, that's kind of what this was. That was the idea behind this system, was that countries could be supported and could be prosperous, and the United States would help them only if they rejected the influence of the Soviets. And this is almost a perfect reflection of how this whole war, how the Cold War is actually played out. So because the Soviets aren't happy, they decide to fight back. They do a little something about it. So with the U.S. taking a stand, the Soviets decided to do something. The first thing that they did is they got really angry at the fact that the United States and the Western world was having all of this influence over the rebuilding of these areas to make them rich. So one big thing that happened out of these whole agreements that we talked about, remember we talked about the Yalta Conference, where the Allies and the Soviets, they got together before the end of World War II and they decided how they were going to divide up Germany before Germany had even surrendered. Well, once Germany surrendered, they divided it up into all these zones of control. And in Berlin, which was the capital of Germany, they divided that city into different zones of control. One side was basically ruled by the Allies, the other side was basically ruled by the Soviets. And so we have the separation in this city that was actually all the way over in Russian territory. So I can go back and we can look at the map here real quick. But I want to point out to you guys when we start talking about the Berlin Airlift. So the Iron Curtain that runs through here, all right, we have all this influence on the communist side and then the capitalist side. Well, Berlin is actually located up over here. And so what happens is that the city is actually on the side of communist influence. But according to the Yalta Conference, they separated the city up. They still just divided it. They cut it right down the middle and said, these people get one side, basically the capitalists get one side, the communists get the other. Well, because the United States was just throwing money at everything, the side of Berlin that was influenced by the United States was much more prosperous. They were rebuilding quicker, they were getting tons and tons of money, and their economy was growing, and it was like this growing, bustling city. Well, the other side of the city that was ruled by the communists was still trying to rebuild from the war. They were progressing much, much slower. And so this made the Soviets actually really angry. And so what they actually decided to do is they block off all of Berlin. Because Berlin sits within Soviet territory, they block off the backside so that people that lived in West Berlin couldn't go over to the capitalist-controlled areas of Europe. They stopped all the trains, they stopped all the food, they stopped all the transport, and they basically held Berlin hostage. And they wouldn't let people travel in and out. Now, the United States' response to this is that they started flying in all of the supplies to help keep the people of West Berlin fed and clothed and help them survive this whole blockade until the Soviets eventually gave up. But this was kind of a way that the Soviets wanted to strike back. They wanted to do something to try to regain support and regain territory when it came to the Cold War. Now, the Soviets didn't like the capitalists and this democratic influence being so near the areas that they controlled. That's part of the reason why they did this. Because people could go from East Berlin to West Berlin and see that life was better in West Berlin. And it would reflect badly on communism. And so they didn't want that bad reflection. They didn't want that fight. They didn't want their people questioning what they were forcing them to do. And so they were trying to remove that influence. Now, it doesn't eventually work. Eventually, the Soviets give up. West Berlin gets to stay intact. The United States is allowed to kind of send supplies and stuff by train and transport now instead of just flying it in. But this was a major mark on this kind of roadmap of the Cold War. So after the Soviets fight back, guys, the Cold War really starts to escalate, and this is when we see it divide the world. and this is what I want to make sure to ram home to you guys here today, is that the Cold War starts to see the world divided upon these two sides, these two lines, just kind of like we saw with different wars, with World War I and World War II. The Cold War calls upon that same idea. Guys, this war was marked by a struggle of political differences that were carried on by means that were just short of military action or war. See, I included this definition right here to help you understand exactly what a Cold War is. Oh, back it up here, okay? Exactly what a Cold War is. It's a struggle over political differences, but it's carried on by means that are just short of military action. All right, they're not going to full-blown war with their militaries. Instead, they're spying on each other. They're using other countries to fight one another's influence. All right, it's not about this overt military action. That's why it's cold. There's no outright military war, okay? But in 1949, as all of these things start to escalate, the world starts to pick a side, okay? And so we see two sides start to form in this whole thing called the Cold War. We see NATO, which stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, all right? That was a group of countries, there was 10 countries that got together and said, we support the United States, we support capitalism and democracy in this whole conflict. And so that was NATO. That was these group of countries that got together and said, this is the idea that we support. Now, on the other side, okay, the side that was in competition with this, we had the Warsaw Pact. That was a group of about 5 countries, most of them within the Soviet influence of the Soviet bloc, that supported the Soviet Union. And so we end up with NATO versus the Soviet Union by 1949, or NATO versus the Warsaw Pact by 1949. And these countries constantly battle against one another. And these groups will see them start to grow at war, and then they take this influence and they take this conflict into other places around the world, like Korea, like China, like Vietnam. All of those conflicts, or Iran, all of those different places that end up in war are a result of the world taking sides in this battle between capitalist influence and communist influence. So the Cold War divides the world. We end up with NATO and the Warsaw Pact, and that sets us up for the rest of what we discuss with the Cold War. So guys, if you have these notes and you've been following along, all right, then you have covered the stuff that we need to know for today to take your quiz. Now, something I want to reiterate to you guys. If you go over here to Classroom, all right, you see right here the quiz that I'm talking about, all right? So this is the start of the Cold War, little quick quiz, 10 quick questions that you're going to go through and answer based on the things that we have already talked about yesterday and today to set us up for our understanding with the Cold War. You guys have been doing awesome keeping up with this and following along. I'm happy and proud of you guys that you're showing up and getting this done. Keep up the good work. Make sure to get your quiz done. Keep these notes by your side. Tomorrow, we'll meet again at 11 a.m. We'll get together. We'll talk about a few details. We're going to watch the Cold War Oversimplified, kind of like we did with World War II, which is always really fun. But that's where we're going to end our week tomorrow at 11. So if you're done, if you know what's up and you got this quiz ready to go, then feel free. Class is over for today. I will see you tomorrow at 11. Thanks for showing up, guys. You've been doing awesome. Stay on top of your work and finish these last 2 weeks strong so that we can be happy as we move on.